The vote passed in under 4 seconds, and nobody in that chamber noticed me stop breathing. I was sitting 3 rows back from the central platform, wearing the gray sash of a trade liaison, a rank so low that most delegates forgot I existed the moment I sat down. That was the point. That was always the point. For 3 years I had trained myself to be forgettable, to keep my eyes down, to translate cargo manifests and grain quotas and border disputes between species who did not think a human could follow their language, let alone speak it. They were wrong. I had learned Caliph the way you learn to hold your breath underwater, slowly, painfully, until it stopped feeling like drowning. And on that day, in that chamber, my breath caught for a different reason. The High Delegate, a broad-shouldered being named Threlkin with skin like poured iron, raised one hand and said a single word: Ashkavel, containment. The screens above the platform lit up with a star chart I recognized instantly, because I had stared at that exact pattern of stars every night as a child from my grandmother's porch. Sol, Earth, home. The word beneath the star chart was not translated into any diplomatic language. It did not need to be softened, because as far as anyone in that room knew, there was no human present who could read it. Eradication, full biological clearance of the third planet, authorized, scheduled. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face empty. Every instinct in my body wanted to stand up and scream that they were wrong, that we were not what their reports said we were, that 4 billion years of evolution on a small blue world did not deserve to be erased because a committee found us inconvenient. But screaming would have done nothing except get me removed from the room, and removed from the only seat in the galaxy where I could still do something. So I sat, and I listened, and I understood every terrible detail. The fleet was called the Ninth Correction. It was not a war fleet, not officially, because a war fleet required a formal declaration, and a formal declaration required a review by the wider Concordance Assembly, an assembly that included several species who still remembered what it felt like to almost be erased themselves. The Ninth Correction was classified instead as a containment action, a bureaucratic sleight of hand that let Threlkin and his allies skip the review entirely. It was clever. It was efficient. It was the kind of quiet, procedural cruelty that never shows up in history books because history books need drama, and this had none. Just paperwork. Just a vote. Just 4 seconds, and then it was done. I had come to this posting as part of what my own government called a cultural exchange, a small diplomatic foothold that let a handful of humans live and work among the Caliph Concordance while pretending we were not desperately trying to understand a civilization that could crush us without trying. My official title was Junior Liaison. My real assignment, known to perhaps 6 people back on Earth, was to listen. Just listen. Report anything unusual through the slow, careful channels that took weeks to move a single sentence from this station back to Earth, encrypted and disguised as trade data, because open communication would have exposed exactly what I was. Weeks. The Ninth Correction was scheduled to launch in 11 days. I did the math in my head while the chamber moved on to unrelated business, voices rising and falling around me in a language that used to feel like music and now felt like a countdown. 11 days. My reports took a minimum of 19 to reach anyone who could act on them, and that assumed nothing went wrong, that no relay station flagged the traffic, that Earth's government believed a message this impossible the moment it arrived. Even in the best case, help would arrive 4 days after my planet did not need help anymore, because there would be nothing left to help. Channels were not going to save anyone. I understood that with a clarity that frightened me more than the vote itself. I was going to have to do this myself. I want to be honest about what that thought felt like, because I think people imagine bravery as something warm, something that fills your chest like light. It did not feel like that. It felt like ice water dropped straight into my stomach, because I knew exactly how small I was in that room. I was one human, 29 years old, 5'6", with no army, no ship, no authority beyond a rank so minor it barely allowed me to request extra printing paper without 3 signatures. Every being around me was taller, older, wiser in the ways of interstellar politics than I could ever hope to become in whatever time I had left. But I also knew something none of them did. I knew what it meant to be underestimated, and I knew how to use it. The session ended the way it always did, with a slow, ceremonial exit of delegates by rank, highest first. I waited in my seat, counting the beats of silence, watching feet and boots and clawed limbs pass by without a glance in my direction. When the room finally emptied, I allowed myself exactly one breath where I let my composure crack, just enough to press my palm flat against the cool metal of the table in front of me, and remind myself that panic was a luxury I could not afford yet. Then I stood, gathered my data slate, and walked out like nothing in the galaxy had changed. My quarters were small, a single room with a narrow window that looked out over the docking spires of the station, dozens of ships coming and going in slow, graceful arcs against a violet sky that never turned dark. I had lived there for 3 years, and never once let myself think of it as home, because home was still Earth, still the porch, still my grandmother's voice telling me to come inside before the stars came out. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my slate and stared at a blank message for a long time. I could still send the warning through official channels. I could still do the safe thing, the sanctioned thing, the thing that would not end my career or my freedom if it was discovered. 19 days. 4 billion people who would never know a countdown had already started for them. I closed the blank message without sending it. Instead, I opened a different file, one I was not authorized to access, one I had built quietly over 3 years of late nights and careful curiosity, disguised as research notes on Calith administrative culture. It was a map, not of stars but of people. Names, ranks, weaknesses, debts, old grudges, careless mistakes, recorded in supply logs, that nobody thought a junior liaison would ever read twice. I had built it because understanding a civilization was my actual job, the one I loved before it became a matter of survival. Now it was the only weapon I had. Somewhere in that fleet's staging schedule was a single loose thread, and I intended to find it before the ships ever left dock. I began with the supply convoys, because ships do not fly on ambition alone. They fly on fuel, on parts, on food for crews who complain about rations in every language in the galaxy, human or otherwise. The 9th correction needed to be provisioned before it could launch, and provisioning required manifests, and manifests required signatures, and signatures could be delayed by exactly the kind of small, boring administrative error that nobody bothers to question. I found what I needed just before midnight station time, a routing authorization for a convoy carrying coolant cores to the staging point, scheduled to depart in 2 days. It was signed by a mid-level logistics officer named Dessa, a Calith woman who I had once helped untangle a shipment error during my very first month on the station, back when I was still learning which end of a cargo manifest was which. She had thanked me at the time with genuine warmth, the kind that made me remember not every being in that chamber thought of humans as vermin waiting to be swept aside. What I did not contact Dessa. I did something smaller, something that would not implicate her, something that would look, if anyone ever checked, like an honest clerical mistake made by an overworked junior liaison trying to be helpful. I adjusted a single destination code on a low-priority manifest, rerouting one supply convoy through a secondary relay station instead of directly to the staging point. It would cost them 3 days, maybe 4, if the weather patterns around that relay held. It was not victory. It was not even close to victory. It was 4 days, purchased with a lie so small it barely counted as one, and it was the only thing standing between my planet and a fleet that did not yet know one human was already awake, already watching, already refusing to let this happen without a fight. I sat back from my slate and looked out at the violet sky, at the ships gliding silently between the spires, none of them yet aware that somewhere below them, in a small gray room, a countdown had just been quietly, invisibly, extended. 4 days would not be enough. I knew that even as I made the change. But 4 days was not nothing, and nothing had ever been the plan I was willing to accept. I thought of my grandmother's porch, of the stars I used to point at without knowing their true distances, without knowing that somewhere among them a species called the Caliph had decided, in 4 seconds, that people like her did not deserve to keep existing. I thought of how easily that decision had been made, how casually, how it had not even required raised voices or dramatic speeches, just a single word on a screen and a room full of beings who agreed without argument. They had planned this so carefully. They had accounted for fleets, for defenses, for the slow diplomatic channels that would never move fast enough to matter. What they had not accounted for was a junior liaison with a gray sash and a memorized language and 3 years of patient, careful listening, sitting quietly in the 4th row, already awake, already working, long before anyone realized there was anything left to stop. I closed my slate, lay back on the narrow bed, and allowed myself exactly 10 minutes of fear before I made myself stand up again. 10 minutes, and then I had work to do, because 11 days had just become 15, and 15 days was a window I intended to use for everything it was worth. Somewhere above me, ships continued their slow, silent arcs toward a staging point that no longer knew exactly when it would be ready, and somewhere far below, on a small blue planet that had no idea how close it had just come to ending, people went on with their ordinary lives, unaware that a single human, alone, unarmed, and terrified, had just decided she was not going to let them go quietly. 4 days bought me nothing but a slightly longer walk toward the same cliff, and I knew it. By the second morning of my small, quiet sabotage, I had already moved on to the next problem, because a single delayed convoy was not a plan, it was a pause button, and pause buttons do not stop fleets from launching, they only stall them. I needed to understand why the 9th correction had been authorized in the first place, not just how, and that meant going somewhere far more dangerous than a supply manifest. It meant going into the archive. The Caliph kept records of everything, every vote, every session, every private committee meeting that technically counted as public record, even though almost nobody outside the ruling class ever bothered to look. That was their blind spot, the one I had noticed years ago and filed away without knowing it would ever matter. They did not hide their cruelty, because they assumed no one who could understand it would ever want to look. Secrecy through obscurity, not through actual concealment. It was almost funny, in the way that things stop being funny the moment they become useful. The archive terminal I needed access to sat in a records annex 2 levels below the main chamber, staffed by a handful of clerks who processed requests slower than glaciers moved. I had visited that annex a dozen times over the years, always for boring reasons, always leaving an impression so unremarkable that the clerks barely looked up when I walked in. This time I walked in the same way, shoulders low, sash straight, data slate held against my chest like it held nothing more exciting than a grain report. The clerk on duty that day was a thin, quiet Caliph named Oren, someone I had spoken to perhaps 5 times in 3 years, always about nothing important. I asked him, in careful, unremarkable Caliph, for access to the session logs of the Containment Committee, framing it as research for a trade impact assessment, the kind of dry bureaucratic phrase that made most beings stop listening before you even finished the sentence. Oren barely glanced at me before granting the request, exactly as I had hoped. What I found in those logs over the next several hours made my hands shake in a way 3 years of training had never quite prepared me for. The vote had not been a sudden decision. It had been building for months, buried in committee notes about resource pressure along a border region humanity did not even know it was contesting, notes about our expansion rate, our weapons development, our stubborn refusal to stay confined to a handful of systems the way smaller, quieter species did. There was no single villain in those records, no dramatic monologue about humanity's threat to the galaxy. There was only a slow, grinding accumulation of small fears, each one reasonable on its own, each one building toward a decision so large that by the time it reached a vote, it felt inevitable to everyone in that room. That terrified me more than any single cruel sentence could have. It meant there was no one lever to pull, no single mind to change. It meant the only thing standing against an entire civilization's quiet consensus was one exhausted anthropologist with a stolen archive file and a rapidly shrinking window of time. I found the loophole on the third hour of reading, buried in a procedural footnote so small I almost skimmed past it twice. Ancient Caliph law, older than the concordance itself, required any action affecting a species with an active diplomatic presence to be reviewed by the full assembly rather than a subcommittee, regardless of how that action was classified. The Containment Committee had gotten around this by arguing, in a single dense paragraph, that Earth's diplomatic presence did not count because our exchange program was classified as cultural rather than political. It was a lie built on a technicality, and technicalities I had learned over 3 years of watching this civilization argue with itself were the one thing the Caliph took more seriously than almost anything else. If I could prove our presence was political, if I could force the vote back in front of the full assembly, the containment order would have to be reviewed by species who had never even heard of it, species who might object simply because they had not been consulted, regardless of how they felt about humanity itself. It was not much, but it was the first real crack I had found in 3 years of careful, quiet listening, and I intended to widen it until something broke. I needed proof, though, something more solid than a footnote I had read alone in a records annex. I needed a witness, someone with standing inside the concordance who could confirm what our exchange program actually was, and I needed someone who would not immediately report me the moment I asked. That was when I thought of Dessa. I found her 2 days later in a maintenance corridor near the docking spires, overseeing the very convoy I had quietly delayed, though she did not know that yet. She looked tired, in the particular way that mid-level officers look tired everywhere in the galaxy, worn down by decisions made above her that she had no power to change. I approached carefully, keeping my tone light, reminding her gently of the shipment error I had helped her untangle years earlier, watching her expression soften with recognition before I said anything that mattered. I did not tell her everything. I was not foolish enough for that. I told her only that I had found a procedural irregularity in a recent committee decision, something that might affect trade relations badly enough to hurt her department if it went unchallenged, and I asked, carefully, whether she would be willing to confirm, on record, the nature of Earth's diplomatic classification. Dessa studied me for a long moment, and I watched calculation move behind her eyes, the same calculation I imagine crosses every reasonable person's face when a stranger asks them to put their name on something risky. Then she said something I did not expect. She said that she had heard rumors about the containment vote, whispered between officers who were uneasy about a decision made so quickly, so quietly, without the usual public debate such matters normally received. She said she did not like it either. It was not trust. Not yet. It was something smaller and more fragile, a shared discomfort between two people who both suspected something had gone wrong and neither of whom yet knew how large that wrongness truly was. But it was enough for her to agree to a private, recorded statement confirming that our exchange program had, in fact, been treated as a political presence in at least 3 prior trade negotiations, a detail buried in her own department's records. That single statement, small as it seemed, was the first thread of a rope I intended to build strong enough to hold an entire fleet in place. I spent the following days moving carefully between the archive, the docking spires, and my own small quarters, gathering fragments the way you gather kindling before a fire, not yet knowing which piece would finally catch. I found 2 more officers willing to speak quietly, neither of them brave exactly, both of them simply uncomfortable enough with what they had witnessed to want it examined properly rather than rushed through in silence. I found a retired assembly clerk, ancient even by Caliph standards, who remembered the last time a species had been erased under a similar technicality, and who spoke about it with a bitterness that told me this was not the first time this civilization had done something it later tried very hard to forget. Piece by piece, the shape of my plan changed. I had begun thinking I needed to stop a fleet. I slowly realized I needed to stop a decision, and decisions, unlike fleets, could sometimes be undone by nothing more than being forced into the light. But every step I took left a trace, and traces, I would soon learn, do not stay hidden forever. On the 9th day, as I left the records annex with another quiet request, logged under another dry, boring pretext, I felt eyes on me for the first time since the vote. I did not turn around immediately. I had learned, over 3 careful years, that turning around too quickly was the fastest way to confirm you had something worth hiding. Instead, I continued walking at the same unhurried pace, my data slate held loosely at my side, my breathing controlled even as my pulse climbed. When I finally allowed myself a glance back, near the junction leading toward the docking spires, I saw a Calith security officer standing near the annex entrance, tall, still, watching not the crowd around her but specifically the space where I had just been. Her uniform bore a rank insignia I recognized from the Containment Committee's own security detail, which meant she was not ordinary station security. She was someone who answered directly to the people who had authorized the 9th correction. Her name, I would learn only a day later through Dessa's careful, worried inquiries, was Vess. I did not know yet whether she suspected me specifically, or whether she was simply doing routine sweeps in response to whispered discomfort spreading quietly through the lower ranks. I did not know whether the pieces I had gathered so far were enough to survive real scrutiny, or whether everything I had built over 9 desperate days would collapse the moment someone with real authority decided to look closely. What I did know was that 15 days had become 6, and 6 days was not enough time to be careful and thorough both. I would have to choose, soon, between moving faster and moving safely, and I already suspected, standing there in that corridor with a stranger's eyes still lingering on the space I had just left, which choice I was going to make. Vess did not approach me directly, not at first, and that quiet patience frightened me more than a confrontation would have. A confrontation I could have prepared for, rehearsed answers for, controlled. Silence gave her the advantage of time, and time was the one resource I had less of than her. I noticed her twice more over the next 2 days, always at a distance, always positioned in a way that could be explained as coincidence, if anyone bothered to ask. Once near the annex entrance again, once outside the small canteen where station workers gathered for their midday meal. I began varying my routes, doubling back through corridors I normally avoided, spacing out my visits to the archive so widely that Oren began asking, gently, whether my trade assessment was taking longer than expected. I told him bureaucracy moved slowly everywhere, and he laughed in the particular tired way that clerks laugh when they agree completely. Dessa reached out to me on the 11th day, her voice tight over a private channel I had given her weeks earlier, for emergencies neither of us had expected to need so soon. She told me, carefully, that a security inquiry had been opened, not against me by name yet, but against unusual archive activity connected to the Containment Committee's records. She told me Vess was leading it personally. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what that meant for the statement she had already given me. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said it meant she had already decided, before I even asked, to stand by it, because she had thought about the containment vote every night since we last spoke, and she found she could not make peace with what it meant for a species to be erased through a technicality instead of an honest, open decision made in front of everyone who had a right to weigh in. She said that frightened her far more than any inquiry did. I did not deserve that kind of courage from someone I had known for years, but never truly counted as a friend, and I told her so. She said friendship was a strange word for 2 people who mostly used to argue about cargo manifests, but that she supposed it applied now regardless. That small exchange gave me more strength than I expected, but strength alone does not stop an inquiry, and 2 days later, on what I now understood was day 13 of my shrinking window, Vess finally approached me directly. She found me in the records annex itself, standing near a terminal I had genuine reason to be using, reviewing an actual trade dispute I still had to manage alongside everything else, because the galaxy, cruelly, does not pause its ordinary demands simply because you are trying to save your entire species. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood beside me, close enough that Oren, several desks away, pretended very hard to be occupied with something else. She asked, in a tone that was almost gentle, whether I had found what I was looking for in the Containment Committee's session logs. I did not deny having accessed them. Denial, I had learned from 3 years of watching this civilization negotiate everything from trade routes to marriage contracts, was almost always the first thing a guilty party tried, and almost always the first thing that confirmed guilt to someone paying close attention. Instead, I told her the truth, or a careful, narrow version of it. I told her I had been reviewing procedural history related to Earth's diplomatic classification, because as the acting liaison for my own species, I had a professional obligation to understand any decision that might affect our standing, however that decision happened to be classified. Vess studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment. She was not unintelligent, and I could see her weighing the technical truth of my answer against the much larger question underneath it, the one neither of us said aloud yet. Finally, she told me that continued unsupervised access to committee records by a foreign liaison was, at minimum, a procedural irregularity that required formal review, and that I should expect to be summoned before a disciplinary panel within the week. A disciplinary panel was not the worst outcome I had imagined, but it was close. A formal review would freeze my movements, restrict my archive access, and place me under exactly the kind of scrutiny that made it impossible to finish gathering what I still needed. Worse, if that panel decided my activity constituted genuine interference in concordance affairs, the consequences could escalate far beyond a simple reprimand, toward confinement, toward the kind of quiet, indefinite detention that station bureaucracies used when they wanted a problem to simply stop existing without the mess of an actual trial. I thanked her for the warning, kept my voice steady, and walked back to my quarters with my heart hammering so hard I was certain she must have heard it. That night, I allowed myself, for the first time since the vote, to genuinely consider the possibility that I was going to fail. Not fail gently, not fail in a way that let someone else pick up where I left off, but fail completely, alone, in a small gray room on a station full of beings who had already decided my entire species was an inconvenience worth erasing. I thought about my grandmother's porch again, about the stars, about how strange it was that the same sky I used to find so comforting now contained a fleet counting down toward the end of everything I loved. I did not sleep much that night. I spent most of it doing the only thing I still could, which was work, because giving up felt like a luxury reserved for people who still had time to spare, and I no longer did. I reached out, carefully and at real risk, to the retired assembly clerk I had spoken with earlier, an ancient caliph named Ilvash who remembered the last erasure this civilization had quietly carried out generations ago. I asked her, directly this time, whether she would be willing to speak publicly, not just to me in private, about what she remembered, and about the pattern she had already noticed forming again with humanity's case. Ilvash did not answer immediately. She was old enough to have outlived most of the personal risk that came with speaking honestly, but she was also old enough to understand exactly how much damage the powerful could still do to someone they decided was inconvenient. When she finally spoke, she said something that stayed with me through everything that followed. She said that she had spent her whole long life staying quiet, because staying quiet was safer, and that safety, in the end, had never once made her proud of herself. She said she was tired of being safe. With Ilvash's agreement, along with Dessa's statement and the 2 other officers who had quietly come forward, I finally had something that felt less like scattered fragments and more like an actual case. Not proof of a conspiracy exactly, but proof that Earth's diplomatic status had been misclassified, proof that the committee's own procedures had been bent to avoid the scrutiny a full assembly review would have brought, and proof, through Ilvash's memory, that this was not the first time such bending had been used to erase a species quietly rather than openly. It was still not enough on its own. A handful of testimonies from low-ranking officers and 1 retired clerk would be dismissed easily by a committee determined to protect its own decision, especially once that committee learned the human gathering them was already under formal review. I needed a way to put this evidence somewhere it could not simply be dismissed, somewhere the entire concordance, not just a closed committee, would be forced to look at it. I needed to make it public, And publicly, on a station like this, meant only one thing. It meant the Assembly's own open record, the same technically public archive that had let me read the containment logs in the first place, because nobody expected a human to bother looking. The irony was not lost on me. Their carelessness had let me find the crack. Their carelessness was about to let me force it open in front of everyone. But the disciplinary panel was scheduled for 3 days from now, and once it convened, my archive access would be suspended entirely, along with, likely, my freedom to move around the station without an escort. 3 days to find a way into a system designed specifically to prevent exactly what I intended to do. 3 days while Vess watched my every move more closely than she had before. 3 days with a fleet somewhere beyond the docking spires still quietly, patiently preparing to leave. I sat in my quarters that night, staring at the violet sky through my narrow window, and made a decision that frightened me more than anything else I had done since the vote. I decided I was not going to wait for the panel to come to me. I was going to move first, publicly, irreversibly, before they had the chance to stop me quietly the way this civilization clearly preferred to stop its problems. I did not know yet exactly how I would do it. I only knew that waiting had run out of time, and that whatever came next, I would rather fail loudly, in front of everyone, than fail quietly in a room no one would ever hear about. The Concordance's open assembly record was not difficult to access. That was never the problem. Any citizen, any liaison, any curious visitor could technically submit a statement to it, because the record existed as a symbol of transparency, a proud, ancient tradition the Caliph liked to display to visiting species as proof of their fairness. The problem was that submissions to the open record were reviewed before publication by a small administrative office, and that office answered, eventually, to the very committee I was trying to expose. If I submitted my evidence through the normal process, it would be quietly delayed, buried, or rejected on some minor technicality long before anyone outside the committee ever saw it. I needed a way around the review, and I needed it within 3 days, before the disciplinary panel took away my access entirely. I found my answer in something Ilvash mentioned almost in passing during our second conversation, a detail she did not even realize was useful until I asked her to explain it twice. She told me that ceremonial statements, submissions made during formal assembly sessions rather than through the administrative office, bypassed the review process entirely, because tradition held that no citizen's voice should be silenced while the full assembly was physically gathered to hear it. It was an old rule, rarely used, mostly forgotten, kept alive only because removing it would have required the assembly to formally vote against its own founding principle of openness, something no politician wanted their name attached to. There was a full assembly session scheduled in 2 days, the last one before the disciplinary panel would convene against me. It was meant to address an unrelated trade dispute between 2 mining collectives, nothing to do with Earth, nothing to do with the containment vote. But it was, according to Ilvash, a real assembly session, physically gathered, which meant the ceremonial rule applied. If I could stand in that chamber and make a ceremonial statement before the session closed, my evidence would enter the open record instantly, unreviewed, unable to be quietly buried by the committee afterward. The risk was enormous. Ceremonial statements were rare enough that making one as a foreign liaison would draw immediate, intense attention, likely ending whatever freedom I had left the moment I finished speaking. But it would also mean the evidence existed, permanently, publicly, in front of every species with a seat in that chamber, whether the containment committee liked it or not. I spent the following 2 days preparing with a focus I did not know I still had left in me. I organized every piece of evidence into a single, clear statement, stripped of anything that could be dismissed as emotional appeal, because I understood by now that this civilization respected procedure far more than passion. I rehearsed the statement until I could deliver it without looking at my slate even once, because hesitation, in that chamber, would be read as weakness, and weakness would be used against me before I finished my first sentence. Dessa helped where she could, quietly confirming logistical details about assembly protocol that I had no way of verifying myself. Ilvash, despite her age, insisted on walking me through the exact ceremonial phrasing required to invoke the old rule correctly, because getting the wording wrong would let the assembly's presiding officer dismiss my statement as improper before I even reached the important part. Vess, meanwhile, grew more visible rather than less, clearly aware that something was building even if she could not yet prove what. On the final evening before the session, she found me again, this time outside my own quarters, waiting with a patience that told me she had been there for some time. She did not threaten me. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would have been easier, in some strange way, if she had. Instead, she asked me, quietly, whether I understood what I was risking. She told me she had reviewed my file more closely than the disciplinary panel required, and that she had noticed something the panel had not, that every irregular action I had taken traced back to the same containment vote, and that a pattern like that suggested either genuine misconduct or genuine belief that something in that vote was wrong. I told her the truth, because I had run out of reasons to keep lying to the one person who seemed, despite everything, to actually be listening. I told her about the star chart, about the word beneath it, about 4 seconds deciding the fate of an entire planet without a single voice from that planet ever being heard. I told her about the technicality that let them skip the review a species like mine was legally owed. Vess was silent for a long time after that. When she finally spoke, she did not promise to help me, and she did not promise to stop me either. She told me only that she would be present at tomorrow's session in her official capacity, and that whatever happened, she intended to see it happen honestly. I did not know, standing there in that corridor, whether that was a threat or something closer to permission, and I still do not fully know today, though I have come to believe it was neither, that it was simply one being deciding, quietly, that she was tired of watching decisions get made in the dark. The assembly session began the next day, exactly as scheduled, delegates filing in by rank, the same slow ceremony I remembered from the day the containment vote passed, except this time I was not sitting quietly in the 4th row, waiting to disappear. I was standing near the ceremonial petitioner's post at the base of the platform, a place reserved for citizens invoking rarely used procedural rights, a place that immediately drew the attention of every delegate filing past me, exactly as I knew it would. The mining dispute proceeded first, tedious and lengthy, exactly the kind of business this session had been scheduled for. I stood through nearly 2 hours of it, legs aching, pulse steady, only because I forced it to be, watching the presiding officer, a heavy-set Caliph elder named Thesrel, glance toward me with growing curiosity as the minutes passed and I did not leave. When the mining dispute finally concluded and Thesrel asked, as ceremonial tradition required, whether any citizen present wished to invoke the open petition before the session closed, I stepped forward before my own fear could stop me. I spoke the ceremonial phrasing exactly as Ilvash had taught me, formal, precise, invoking a rule so old that several younger delegates visibly turned to their neighbors in confusion, unsure what was even happening. Thesrel, older and clearly familiar with the tradition, studied me for a long moment before granting the floor, perhaps out of simple procedural obligation, perhaps out of the same curiosity that had made him watch me for the last 2 hours. I will not pretend my voice did not shake at first. It did, but I had rehearsed too long and too carefully to let that shaking stop me, and within the first minute, something steadied in my chest, some old anthropologist's instinct that understood, finally, that I was not just fighting for survival anymore. I was presenting evidence, and evidence, in front of the right audience, has a power all its own. I laid out the timeline plainly. The containment vote, the classification loophole, Dessa's confirmed statement about Earth's true diplomatic status, the 2 other officers who had quietly corroborated the pattern, Ilvash's memory of a previous species erased under a nearly identical technicality, a memory the chamber's older delegates clearly recognized the moment I described it, several of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I did not accuse anyone by name, I did not need to. I simply laid the pieces down in order and let the shape of them speak for itself, the same way I had once quietly mapped Caliph administrative culture for the sheer curiosity of understanding it, never imagining that same map would someday become the only tool standing between my planet and its own quiet erasure. The chamber did not explode into chaos the way I half expected. It was worse, in a way, because it was quieter than that. I watched understanding spread across the room in slow, uneven waves, delegate by delegate, species by species, as they realized a decision affecting an entire world had been made without the review their own laws technically required, and that they, sitting in that very chamber, had never been told. Threlkin, the High Delegate, who had spoken the word Ashkavel with such calm certainty weeks earlier, rose from his seat before I finished, his voice sharp with a fury I had never heard from him before, demanding the petition be struck from record as procedurally invalid. But Thesrol, to my enormous relief, reminded the chamber, evenly and without apparent favor toward either side, that the ceremonial rule had already been correctly invoked, and that the statement, once spoken, was permanent, regardless of what the assembly chose to do with it afterward. It was done. Whatever happened next, the truth now existed somewhere it could not be quietly erased. What followed was not a clean victory, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories sometimes make triumphs feel simpler than they really are. What followed was chaos, weeks of it. Delegates from species who had never even been consulted demanding formal answers about why a containment order had been authorized in their name without their knowledge. Factions within the concordance, turning on each other over who had known what and when. The entire fragile unity that had let the vote pass in 4 seconds, fracturing under the weight of its own secrecy, now exposed. The 9th corrections launch, scheduled for that very week, was suspended within 2 days, not out of mercy, not because anyone suddenly decided humanity deserved to exist, but because no fleet commander wanted to launch an action currently under formal assembly dispute, not when the political cost of being wrong had just become horrifyingly public. I did not stop a war fleet through strength. I stopped it by making silence impossible, by dragging a decision made in darkness into a room full of witnesses who could not, once they had seen it, pretend they had not. Vess found me again that evening, standing quietly near the docking spires where I had once watched ships glide in slow, unknowing arcs toward a staging point that had just gone still. She did not say much. She told me only that she had watched the entire session, that she had expected, going in, to eventually have to escort me out under formal charge. She said she was glad, in the end, that she had not needed to. I asked her what would happen to me now, given that the disciplinary panel scheduled against me had, in all the chaos, never actually convened. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression, for the first time since I had known her, softened into something almost like respect. She told me she did not know yet what would happen to me, only that whatever it was, it would happen in the open now, the same open record I had forced everyone to finally look at, rather than in the quiet, careful shadows this civilization had clearly grown far too comfortable using. I stood there beside her for a long time, watching the still, silent ships above us, and allowed myself, for the first time in 17 exhausting days, to breathe without immediately calculating what came next. The weeks that followed the assembly session did not feel like the ending I had imagined during my darkest nights on that station. There was no sudden celebration, no grand apology delivered to Earth on behalf of an entire civilization ashamed of what it had almost done. What there was, instead, was something slower and stranger, a long, grinding process of a government forced to examine itself in public, one uncomfortable session at a time, while I watched from a position that had changed so completely I barely recognized my own life anymore. The full assembly review, once finally convened under real scrutiny rather than a quiet subcommittee, took nearly a month to complete. I was called to testify twice more, each time in front of a wider audience than the last, until by the final session, delegates from species I had never even met before the crisis sat listening as I explained, calmly and without exaggeration, exactly what 4 seconds of an unreviewed vote had nearly cost an entire world. I found, strangely, that the fear I expected to feel standing in front of so many unfamiliar eyes never fully arrived. I had already stood there once with everything to lose. Everything after that felt, in comparison, almost manageable. Threlkin did not disappear quietly. He fought the review at every stage, arguing that the containment decision, whatever its procedural flaws, had been made in good faith, based on genuine data about humanity's expansion and behavior, and that punishing the committee for acting quickly on a real threat would only teach future leaders to hesitate when hesitation might cost lives. It was, I will admit, not an entirely dishonest argument. There were beings in that chamber who genuinely feared humanity, who had read reports about our history of conflict and our stubborn refusal to stay contained, and who believed, sincerely, that they were protecting their own people by acting before we grew too large to stop. I did not try to convince them that fear was foolish. Fear rarely responds well to being told it is foolish. Instead, during my final testimony, I tried something different. I told them about my grandmother's porch, about pointing at stars as a child, without understanding how far away they truly were, about growing up in a small, quiet corner of a world most of that chamber had only ever seen represented as a threat assessment on a screen. I told them that humanity was not a single decision, a single vote, a single fleet's worth of danger. We were 4 billion individual lives, each one as small and specific and unremarkable as my own had once been, before circumstance forced me into a role I never expected to play. I do not know if that testimony changed any minds that pure procedure could not have. I suspect, honestly, that it did not change many. But Ilvash told me afterward, in her characteristically blunt way, that changing minds had never been the point. Forcing an honest look had been the point. And an honest look, however uncomfortable, was something this civilization had clearly avoided for far too long. The final ruling arrived on the 31st day since the vote that started everything. The 9th correction was formally dissolved, not destroyed in any dramatic sense, simply stood down, its ships reassigned to ordinary border patrol duties. Its staging point emptied, as quietly as it had once been filled. The containment order itself was struck from record as procedurally invalid, and the Assembly issued a formal statement, careful and diplomatically bloodless in the way such statements always are, acknowledging an oversight in classification and committing to a full review of humanity's diplomatic status going forward. It was not justice exactly. Nobody involved in authorizing our erasure faced any real consequence beyond a bruised reputation and a mandated procedural review that most of them would likely find a way to quietly work around eventually. Threlkin remained in his position, chastened but unremoved, and I understood, watching him accept the ruling with a stiff formal nod, that this was not a story where the villain gets punished in any satisfying way. This was a story where a catastrophe simply did not happen, and sometimes, I have come to believe, that has to be enough. My own situation resolved itself in a way I had not fully anticipated. My cover, obviously, was gone entirely. Every delegate in that assembly now knew exactly what I was, not a junior liaison at all, but someone who had spent 3 years quietly learning their language, their culture, their weaknesses, well enough to use all 3 against them when it mattered most. Some delegates found that unforgivable, a betrayal of the trust their cultural exchange program was supposedly built on. Others, more numerous than I expected, found it strangely admirable, evidence that humanity's supposed recklessness contained within it something closer to resourcefulness than they had previously understood. I was not imprisoned, though for several tense days after the ruling, I genuinely believed I might be. Instead, in a decision that surprised nearly everyone, including myself, the Assembly voted to formally recognize my actions as a legitimate exercise of a citizen's ceremonial rights, however unorthodox the circumstances, which meant I could not be punished for the very act that had exposed the truth without also undermining the ruling that had followed from it. It was, I suspect, as much a practical decision as a merciful one. Punishing me would have looked, in front of an assembly that had just spent a month examining its own dishonesty, exactly like the kind of quiet cruelty they had just publicly condemned. What I could not avoid, however, was the end of my life as it had existed for the past 3 years. My position as liaison, built entirely on the fiction that I was an unremarkable minor official, no longer made sense once everyone knew otherwise. I submitted my resignation from the exchange program 2 weeks after the final ruling, not because anyone forced me to, but because I understood, standing in my small quarters for what I already suspected would be one of my last nights there, that the version of myself who had lived quietly in that gray sash for 3 years simply did not exist anymore, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Dessa came to see me the night before I left. She did not say much, which I had come to understand was simply how she expressed things that mattered most to her. She told me only that she had requested a transfer to a border liaison post, somewhere she could keep an eye on how humanity's new diplomatic classification actually played out in practice, and that she intended to make sure nobody quietly tried to reclassify us back into obscurity the moment public attention faded. I told her that sounded exactly like something a friend would do, and for once, she did not argue about the word. Ilvash, characteristically, sent no message at all, only a single line of ancient Caliph text delivered through the station's archive system on my final morning, a proverb I had to look up twice to translate correctly. It read, roughly, that quiet courage is still courage, and that the galaxy remembers those who spoke, not those who stayed comfortable. I kept that message saved long after everything else from that station had been archived away and mostly forgotten. Vess found me last, at the docking spire itself, as I waited for the transport that would carry me back toward Earth for the first time in 3 years. She had been reassigned as well, promoted, in fact, to oversee a newly created oversight office meant to prevent exactly the kind of quiet procedural abuse that had nearly ended my species. She told me she had not decided, even now, whether to be grateful or resentful that a foreign liaison had been the one to force her government into confronting its own failure, rather than her own people managing it themselves. I told her I understood completely, because I had spent 3 years feeling exactly the same conflicted gratitude toward a civilization that had both nearly destroyed my home and, in its own strange procedural way, ultimately allowed me the tools to save it. She said one more thing before I boarded the transport, something I have thought about often in the time since. She said that when the containment vote first passed, every delegate in that room believed they were acting on complete information, confident that no meaningful resistance could possibly exist, because they had accounted for every fleet Earth might build, every alliance we might form, every weapon our scientists might develop given enough time. She said what none of them had ever considered, what none of their careful calculations had ever included, was the possibility that resistance did not require a fleet at all. It only required one person, already present, already listening, already unwilling to accept the ending they had planned. I did not have a clever response to that. I simply nodded and boarded the transport and watched the station shrink behind me until it became just another point of light among thousands, indistinguishable from all the others unless you already knew exactly where to look. The journey home took considerably longer than the frantic 17 days that had defined the crisis itself, weeks of quiet transit through star systems I had once only read about in concordance briefings, and I found, somewhere during that long, uneventful passage, that I finally had time to feel everything I had not allowed myself to feel while the countdown was still running. Fear, mostly, delayed and enormous, the full weight of exactly how close everything had come finally settling over me now that there was nothing left to do but sit with it. But underneath the fear, quieter and more persistent, was something else, something I can only describe as a strange, stubborn pride, not in myself exactly, but in the simple fact that when the moment came, I had not looked away. Earth, when I finally arrived, looked exactly the way I remembered it, and completely different at the same time. My grandmother's porch was still there, the same worn wooden steps, the same view of a sky that no longer felt quite as innocent as it once had, now that I knew exactly what had nearly happened somewhere far beyond it. I sat on those steps my first night home, looking up at stars I could now name in a dead alien language nobody around me would ever need to learn, and allowed myself, finally, completely, to simply exist, without calculating anything at all. The full story of what happened out there has still not been made public. Not entirely, not yet. Earth's government knows, of course. In the careful, classified way governments know things they are not ready for their citizens to fully understand. There will be a time, I suspect, when more of it comes out, when the details of the ninth correction and the assembly vote and everything that followed become something closer to common knowledge rather than a quiet, classified footnote known only to a handful of officials and one exhausted anthropologist who never expected her quiet academic career to end this way. For now, though, I am simply home, sitting most evenings on a porch that survived a threat it will likely never know it faced, watching a sky that very nearly went dark in a way none of us here would have ever understood or seen coming. Somewhere out among those stars, an entire civilization once looked at humanity and decided, calmly, procedurally, in 4 unremarkable seconds, that we were a problem best solved through quiet erasure rather than honest conversation. They had planned for fleets, they had planned for alliances, for weapons, for every conventional shape resistance might take. What they never planned for, what their careful calculations never once considered, was a single human being already inside their walls, already fluent in their language, already awake and listening long before anyone realized there was anything left to hear. They planned humanity's eradication with the confidence of a civilization that believed itself thorough. But one human was already waiting, quietly, patiently, in the 4th row of a chamber they thought held no threat at all, and sometimes, I have come to understand, that is exactly how the largest catastrophes are prevented, not with armies, not with grand declarations, just one person, in the right place, at the right moment, who simply refuses to let the ending happen quietly.